You all right?
Yeah.
You're safe. For now. Marvin Browner.
Thanks.
Obviously someone taught you well.
Yeah. I know how to take care of myself.
Come on.
Following the success of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, a game that garnered praise for bringing the long-standing series of the same name back to its survival horror roots, Capcom released Resident Evil 2 Remake in 2019 with the intention of reviving and modernizing the decades-old classic for a new generation of gamers. And by the looks of it, everyone seems to agree that the game was a success in that regard. Resident Evil 2 merges modern graphics and gameplay with a more old-school game design that emphasizes careful resource management and exploration of intricate puzzle-like levels, both of which are conventions of the earlier, more traditional titles in the survival horror genre that Resident Evil itself helped pioneer. Resident Evil 2 moves away from more cinematic, action-packed shooters and forces the player into claustrophobic corridors and tight rooms, requiring them to have a constant presence of mind about their surroundings, their resources, and their inventory. This slower-paced, more restrictive type of game design lends itself to all kinds of stressful moments of dynamic gameplay that go hand in hand with the horror aspect of the genre. In Resident Evil 2, players are always thinking about what their next move should be on a moment-to-moment basis, and they should always be ready to think quickly and improvise when things go wrong, and they will go wrong often. It should come as no surprise, then, that Resident Evil 2 is a game capable of organically creating many memorable moments. And yet, there is one particular moment that I think about when I think about this game. A moment that has stayed with me and which I remember now as one of my favorite moments in all of gaming. Before I can get into it though, we need to talk about something else first.
Jesus, stay back!
Resident Evil 2's opening area, the Raccoon City Police Department, or RPD, is arguably one of the greatest video game levels ever designed. When you first enter, it looms as a sprawling, maze-like structure that must be approached as carefully and thoughtfully as the things that lurk within it. As I mentioned before, this game places an emphasis on inventory management and exploration. The RPD does not work as a linear experience but rather as a puzzle to be solved. The ultimate goal of the level is established very early on. 3 medallions must be collected to open a secret exit in the main hall of the building, which will then provide a way to escape. The player must constantly retrace their steps, moving back and forth across the many rooms and corridors as they slowly unravel the inner workings of the area, finding along the way many optional items and weapons. In the process of exploring the RPD, players must also carefully manage their resources. Because inventory space is extremely limited, they must constantly think about what items to take with them at specific times. Do you take a flashbang grenade and a healing item to be extra safe, or do you risk it and leave one of them behind in case you find an important item that you must carry back with you? Do you leave behind that healing item you just found, or do you discard some of your ammo to make room for it? Players are constantly forced to think critically about how they manage their resources throughout the game. And to complement this, combat in Resident Evil 2 is just as carefully crafted. Zombies in this game are tough. It requires several bullets to take a single zombie down, and that's if you can get headshots consistently. On the other hand, shooting zombies on the leg will stagger them momentarily, which gives the player a window to run by them without wasting ammo. And since ammo in this game is also limited, it would seem at first glance that it would be better to simply run by every possible zombie. But because players must constantly backtrack through the level, and because zombies don't respawn once they're taken down, killing a pair of zombies for good can be worth it to clear a critical room or hallway. Of course, these decisions will ultimately depend on the resources that a player has. Someone with extra healing items might play in a riskier way, while someone with no healing items might be forced to spend ammo to clear a room just to be safe. The gameplay dynamic changes from moment to moment though. The player carrying extra healing items might make a series of mistakes, for example, and suddenly find themselves in a dangerous position that has them rethinking their strategy. It is this combination of resource and inventory management, dynamic combat that forces the player to improvise, and non-linear level exploration that adds up to Resident Evil 2's stressful but rewarding gameplay that people have come to love. And yet, there inevitably comes a moment when the player becomes a bit too comfortable while navigating the RPD. They become familiar with the level's layout, even as they start to get better at the combat. So, while before, facing two zombies in a tight room might have been terrifying, after a while, players can easily slip through them or take them down in their way to their intended objective. Capcom addresses this in what I think is a brilliant way. If you've played Resident Evil 2, then you know that the RPD is actually split into two gameplay segments. The first one begins when you first reach the RPD and ends when you collect the 3 medallions and make your way into an underground level where you face the game's first boss fight. After this encounter, the player ends up having to make their way back into the RPD and hunt for more items required to solve a puzzle and progress the game. And it is right here, as you return to the now familiar spaces of the RPD, that the game throws you a surprise that completely recontextualizes your relationship to the level and to the gameplay. I'm talking, of course, about Mr. X. Mr. X is a hulking, trenchcoat-wearing, Slenderman on steroids looking enemy whose only purpose is to chase the player as they make their way through the RPD for a second time. Unlike normal zombies, Mr. X can pursue the player through doors and across rooms, barring some safe spaces. And even when the player manages to shake Mr. X temporarily, they can still hear his thumping footsteps, an ever-present sign that he is still out there actively looking for them. By now, this type of stalker enemy is a staple of the Resident Evil series. We have Nemesis from Resident Evil 3, Jack Baker from Resident Evil 7, and more recently, Lady Dimitrescu from Resident Evil Village. But I argue that of all of these, Mr. X from Resident Evil 2 Remake is the most interesting one precisely because of the timing and the manner in which he is introduced into the game. As I mentioned before, Mr. X is introduced exactly at a time when the player is starting to feel a bit too familiar, a bit too complacent with the game's combat as well as with the level layout of the RPD. Mr. X's arrival very quickly changes that. Suddenly having a hulking stalker on their heels brings back the sense of helplessness and stress that players experienced at the beginning of the game. Whereas before, players had gotten comfortable enough to deal with the various combat and navigation hurdles that the game threw at them, facing those same situations with Mr. X's thundering footsteps following close behind makes them appear as terrifying as they were at the beginning. Turning into a hallway to find two zombies in the way might have become easy for the player by that point, but dealing with those same two zombies while Mr. X chases the player turns even this simple problem into a much more complex one. I especially like how Mr. X interacts with another type of enemy that appears in the RPD, the Licker. Lickers are incredibly fast, incredibly aggressive, and incredibly deadly enemies with one crucial weakness: they can't see. Players learn very quickly that the best way to deal with lickers is to simply walk slowly around them. As long as they don't make noise, the licker won't even notice that the player is there. With this in mind, it's hard to think of a moment in any game that is as terrifying and stressful in the best possible way as being suddenly trapped between a licker and Mr. X in Resident Evil 2. One enemy requires that you walk slowly and carefully, the other demands that you run like hell. Mr. X even takes away something that the player has taken for granted from the very moment they stepped into the RPD, the safe space that the main hall represents. The main hall of the RPD functions as a kind of hub that connects several other areas of the level. Enemies can't go into the main hall, and so it becomes a kind of safe space for the player to rest and think about their next step. Later, as the player unlocks more doors, the main hall also becomes a great way to travel safely across the different floors of the RPD. Once Mr. X is introduced, however, even this space becomes dangerous. And this is important because it highlights another aspect of the way in which Mr. X recontextualizes the player's relationship to the game. It is not only the combat that becomes more complex once Mr. X comes into play, it's also the navigation of the level itself. With Mr. X being a constant pressure, the player will start to even doubt which way to go. Rooms that were easy before might not be anymore. They will start asking themselves questions like, did I leave a zombie alive in that room? Did I unlock that door? Would I be able to make a quick getaway if I take this path? Where was I supposed to use the diamond key again? Did I explore that area? What's the best way to reach this room? This is what Mr. X does. He makes the player feel insecure again, which leads to hesitation, which leads to mistakes, and creates situations that can quickly snowball out of control, not only in terms of the combat, but also of the navigation of the level itself. The genius of Mr. X is that he preys on the sense of security that the player has slowly developed over the course of the game and cleanly undermines it. Now, everything I've discussed so far might be enough to claim that the introduction of Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 Remake is one of gaming's most memorable moments, but there's another layer of depth at play here, one that has to do not with gameplay but with the narrative of the game, and it involves Resident Evil 2's take on a zombie cliché, the character of Marvin Branagh. The player encounters Marvin very early on in the game, almost as soon as they enter the RPD, and it becomes immediately obvious what his role in the story will be. Marvin has already been bitten by a zombie, which means that it's only a matter of time before he turns and tries to attack the protagonist/player. After Marvin saves the protagonist from a close call with the zombie, he sets up camp in the main hall of the RPD, establishing this area as the safe space of the level. The irony of this setup is that, in the mind of the player, the main hall is never truly a safe area, not as long as Marvin is there. But this creates an interesting narrative dissonance between the protagonist and the player. Marvin is a trope of zombie stories. He's that one person in the group of survivors who has been bitten and will most likely end up turning at a crucial moment later in the story. Marvin even does the whole cliche thing of looking the protagonist very seriously in the eyes and telling them that if they see one of those things, meaning zombies, they should shoot without hesitation, no matter who it is. This, of course, is Marvin's way of foreshadowing his own turning and preparing the protagonist for it. What he is telling the protagonist is that when he does turn, they should shoot him without hesitation. Part of the cliche is that the protagonist, who happened to be Claire in my first playthrough, naively believes to the very end that Marvin can be saved somehow. If this was a movie, I imagine that Marvin would end up turning exactly at the most precarious and impractical point in the story, and then, despite Marvin's own warning, the protagonist would hesitate to shoot him, which would make things even worse, and if this was a good movie, there would be some consequences for the protagonist because of that hesitation. This is the trope that Marvin is so obviously meant to play from the first moment he is introduced. And the reason I think it works is precisely because of the dissonance between the point of view of the protagonist and that of the player. The protagonist of the game may have a naive reluctance to accept Marvin's fate, but the player recognizes the trope that Marvin is meant to inhabit instantly. The main hall is set up as the safe area of the RPD, and yet every time the player makes it back, there is a moment of hesitation. The player wonders, is Marvin still human, or is this the moment I have to kill him? This wariness creates an emotional distance to Marvin as a character. It's hard for the player to get attached to him when they know he'll turn into a zombie soon. Still, Marvin does become an ally. He doesn't perform any service for the player gameplay-wise, but in terms of the narrative, Marvin becomes, if not a guide, at least the only other human presence in the RPD. Marvin, in a very subtle way, becomes the player's only human connection in a terrifying and dangerous place. Marvin is the sole reason the player is not utterly alone. And while these subtle emotional elements of the narrative might be unnoticeable for the player at first, they suddenly come crashing down on them at exactly the most precarious and impractical moment they have experienced in the game up to that point.
Jesus, stay back!
Everything I've described and analyzed here is based on my personal experience of the game. But when I think about Resident Evil 2, I think about one specific moment. After I collected the 3 medallions and opened the secret path out of the RPD, a cutscene played in which Claire tells Marvin that they can finally escape. Marvin replies that it's too late for him, and Claire finally acknowledges the truth she hasn't been able to accept, that Marvin can't be saved. She thanks him for helping her, and then she leaves. In the back of my mind, I still wasn't convinced. I thought it was weird that Marvin didn't turn at all as I explored the RPD, and that, in fact, there were still areas of the level that I hadn't gotten access to yet. I felt like the game was still trying to set up something, but as I continued on, Marvin faded from my mind. After quote-unquote escaping the RPD, I met a new character, Sherry, and then I fought G, the first boss fight of the game. After that, the game introduces Chief Irons, who kidnaps Sherry. Then follows an underground section with more leakers until, eventually, I ended up having to loop back into the RPD. After a bit more exploration, I put out the fire from a crashed chopper and started to head back to the main hall, and then Mr. X popped up out of nowhere and started chasing me. As I mentioned before, the added pressure of being pursued by Mr. X had my mind running on overdrive. I was heading towards the main hall while chaotically looking at my map and trying to figure out what would be the fastest, safest way to pick up the new items that I needed. I was so single-mindedly focused that I barely realized that I was sprinting down the stairs of the main hall until, at one point, a sudden thought came to me. Wait, isn't Marvin in the main hall? Is he going to be killed by Mr. X? And then I turned around and I saw him, Marvin, already a zombie, slowly shambling towards me. And there I was, unable to move or think anymore, hesitating in the most cliche way despite the fact that Marvin himself had warned me about it. Most of my favorite moments in gaming work like this. Gameplay and narrative are weaved together to create a sequence that could not exist in any other medium. Mr. X preys on and subverts the expectations that the player has developed about the game up to that point. And through the character of Marvin, Resident Evil 2 sets up an old cliche of the zombie genre, one that is also subverted with the help of Mr. X and careful timing. The result is an amazing moment of emerging narrative. The combination of Mr. X's introduction and Marvin's turning overwhelms the player intellectually and emotionally, taking away their sense of safety and making them feel as hopeless as they did in the beginning. The RPD looms as terrifying and desolate as it did at first, even more so since the player is now truly alone and being chased by a hulking creature.
Oh God, no. Marvin. I'm sorry.
The presence of Mr. X is brilliant in the way it recontextualizes the player's relationship to the gameplay. But when taken in conjunction with the slow setup of Marvin's narrative trope, it ends up creating one of the greatest moments I've experienced in any game. I never really cared about Marvin as a character, never really connected with him. I just figured there was going to be some silly cutscene later on where Claire would freeze and wouldn't be able to shoot him, and then that would be that. What I didn't expect was that this moment would happen through gameplay instead of a cutscene, and that I would be the one to stand there frozen. And that is the beauty of this setup. Video games, as a medium for storytelling, are great at creating moments of emergent narrative like this one. But Resident Evil 2 pulls it off because of the careful way they build up to it. The choice of having Marvin turn off screen, of erasing the player's awareness of him by throwing at them new characters, a boss fight, and a terrifying trench coat wearing Slenderman thing. As I was being chased by Mr. X, I was so stressed out and focused that it's not that I forgot that Marvin was going to turn into a zombie, it's that I just forgot about Marvin, period. So that when I ran into him in the middle of the main hall, the sight of him, already turned, it devastated me. To my surprise, seeing Marvin like that actually hit me emotionally. There was something that I had, and I hadn't even realized that I had it, and now, all of a sudden, it was gone. I felt sad for Marvin, and I felt sad that I didn't pay much mind to him before. I felt like I had truly just lost something very valuable. And then, as suddenly as all these feelings surfaced, they were immediately trampled down by the noise of boots pounding against the tile of the main hall. Mr. X was still closing in. There was no time to mourn, no time to stop and think. I had to keep moving forward.
Looks like it leads underground. Good. We can get out of this hellhole. Hey, Marvin! Guess what? I think I found the way out! Marvin, come on. Let's get you out of here. Let's go. Are you okay?
No. Just go. Save yourself.
Come on. It's bad. We gotta get you to hospital
Please,
now.
Claire. We both know how this is going to end. Get out of the city.
I can't just leave you here.
Claire, please, go. Do this for me.
Okay. Hey, Marvin. Thank you.